Me transmiten de la organización que aprovechando que hay unos minutos, va a hacer uso de la palabra el licenciado Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. It's so vital and so brave, and what a wonderful contribution. And that is true of all of the judges here, so I'm very moved by your contribution. I wanted to just add one tool that you know of, but I wanted to emphasize it very briefly for your consideration, and that is the tool of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are commitments of every government in the world, every one of your governments, and really they are our current generation's commitments to realize the economic and social rights of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're not different from human rights. They are the current expression of those human rights. And oh, wait a minute. No, there we go. As you know, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. All 193 UN member states agreed to them. They call on every society to end extreme poverty, promote gender equality, achieve the rule of law, protect the natural environment, ensure access to decent work, stop human trafficking and all forms of modern slavery, end child labor, ensure universal access to health care and education. They map, though you can't see this very well, but I'll leave the presentation, they map to all of the international human rights instruments. They're not something different from the human rights instruments. They are the specific, current, time-bound, to 2030 quantitative objectives of the human rights instruments. They also map to the instruments the American Convention on Human Rights, which itself under the OAS is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So these are tools for you. We know that in the America's context, the right to work, the right to satisfactory conditions of work, trade union rights, right to Social Security, right to health, and so on are all enshrined within the OAS. Unfortunately, the United States, not coincidentally, never ratified this agreement. But these also link back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the PowerPoint, which I'll leave, there is a mapping from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, linking them specifically to treaties that have enshrined these objectives in specific legal instruments globally. So again, these can be used for relatively hard law, not only soft law, and they are the obligations of every one of the countries, from ending poverty, access to health care, access to education, gender equality, access to infrastructure, to decent work with the labor rights, and to the environmental standards as well. Every one of them tracking to specific legal documents, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so forth. So I believe that from your point of view, judges, this is an added instrument that can find value. Our problem, of course, under international law is not only is twofold. One, some powerful countries, most importantly the United States, has simply rejected signing on to many of these covenants. This is the power of greed rather than justice that is talking, because the United States, in its powerful elite, has rejected the human rights to economic and social rights. So this is one of our conundrums. This is why our system is as unjust as it is, because of impunity of the powerful, especially, unfortunately, the United States, which has failed to sign and to honor many of these agreements. The second weakness, though, is that all of these human rights protocols call for a progressive realization of these rights. In other words, these rights from 1948 onward have been understood to require time for their fulfillment. But we've had enough time. We are now, with the urgency of now, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed 71 years ago. It's enough time to have realized these rights. The average income in the world is $12,000 per capita. We don't have a world of poverty. We have poor people in a world of wealth. This is a big difference from where we were 71 years ago. There is no excuse for failing to realize the rights now. And I think that this is a point that I would like to put from a legal point of view. What does progressive realization mean when we are decades late in honoring the most basic standards of justice, and there can be no claim that the resources are unavailable to do this? This is not a matter that needs any more time. Final point that I want to make is that realizing these rights requires budget commitments of governments. In some cases, you can hold your own governments accountable, because middle-income countries can afford all of these objectives out of national budgets. They may choose not to do so. They may give tax cuts and for the rich. They may do many things, but it's affordable. In a country like Brazil, all of these goals can be met. That's the income level. For poorer countries, help is needed from the international community. This is, of course, where some of the greatest injustices are made, because, and I'll show you, a recent study that I did together with the IMF showed that poor countries need to spend 14% of GDP to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but from a world point of view, it's 0.5% of GDP. In other words, if the rich countries help the poor countries, this is a tiny burden for the rich, but an insuperable burden for the poor. So we need global justice as well as the attention of individual governments. SDG 17 calls for global solidarity. Every one of the targets of SDG 17 says that there should be international solidarity, that developed countries should give more aid, that there should be additional resources mobilized for development, that debt should be canceled or restructured of poor countries. If we could figure out a way to sue the United States government, I would strongly recommend it, because it's in violation of all of these norms. This is the level of development aid that's actually given. It's hard to read, but the countries at the top that give up to 1% of their national income, Sweden, not surprisingly, always at the top, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, always giving what is promised. The United States is way down on the list, and Mr. Trump is trying to cut the aid even more. His budget called for a cut by 25%. And then when desperately poor people leave Central America, he says he wants to punish them by cutting more. Or the United States imposes sanctions on Venezuela, for example, which is literally starving the people. In my view, it is a crime against humanity. Whatever you think about the politics in Venezuela, You cannot starve a country. So I believe that these international sanctions are illegal, in violation of the UN Charter. I would encourage governments to take this to the UN General Assembly for consideration, because these are punishments of a whole population, which is an unfathomable injustice in our time. So you have enough problems on your already, but I wanted to introduce this to emphasize we are a rich world that lacks solidarity. That is Pope Francis's core message. It is the core message of this church. Pope Paul VI in Populorum Progressio, the most wonderful encyclical about global economic justice, quoted St. Ambrose saying that when a rich person gives to the poor, he is not giving something to the poor, he is restituting what is already due to the poor, what is already the possession of the poor. We need to put these notions of human rights and basic economic rights into the courts, into the law, and into our daily justice. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias.